Bill Schnee is a musician, producer, Grammy award-winning engineer, and as of recently, a writer, with the release of his new book, Chairman at the Board. With over 50 years in music, Bill has plenty to write about, having worked with the likes of Miles Davis, Steely Dan, Dire Straits, Carly Simon, Ringo Starr, and Whitney Houston, just to name a few. In his book, Bill collects stories and insights of the music business set in a golden age of recording, from his personal experiences working on seminal records with an incredible cast of characters. In this episode, he sits down with John and Stewart to talk about the writing of the book, his early years as a musician and young engineer, his recording ethos, and shares a few stories from the book.
Bill, where are you now? Where are you talking to us from?
I'm in Franklin, Tennessee.
And that's where you live?
Yep.
The hometown of Record Plant alumni Steve Marcantonio, I think. I think he lives in Franklin.
He does.
Too.
I ran into him in the grocery store a while back.
How do you get away from him?
Any way I can. What a wild and crazy guy.
Oh my God, he's more New Jersey than New Jersey. It's the craziest thing, and he hasn't changed. I mean, I saw him last year there. And he's just he's so him. It's so fun. I love him, but he's just a nut.
Oh, yeah. He's great. He's great. You know, there's so much more of a music community here than there ever was in LA, and certainly now. And there's a bunch of, shall we call it, the more well-known engineers that get together occasionally. They invited me in, and we have dinners every once in a while. And
that's great.
He's always the life of the party, needless to say.
Yeah.
Well, that's crazy, Bill, because you really spent a lot of time in LA.
Yeah.
In sort of the major recording years. And you find more of a community in Nashville now than you did back then in LA?
Yeah, to a degree. You know, yeah, I was very fortunate to be there in the glory years, and which is the main reason that I finally got pushed into writing the book.
What brought you there? By the time you got to LA, were you already an engineer?
No. My parents moved to Los Angeles my senior year of high school. I quit college after the first semester because our band was signed as soon as I got out of high school, our band was signed, and they told us we were going to be stars. They lied. And as I wrote, that was the first time the record business lied to me. It wouldn't be the last. But yeah, my Jewish father, doctor, wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer. And so I got into recording, and when I got a job in the studio, just basically to shut him up, I started law school, and I got through the first semester, started the second, and the grades came back, and they were all C's and a B. They weren't good because I was faking it. I didn't have time for everything, sessions, reading, and classwork. So I decided I'll quit for a year and a half, and if music can support me, great. And if not, I'll go back and get the law degree. And as I've often said, the legal system is very happy that I didn't go back, I'm sure.
But, you know, in terms of the book and everything, we're not going to ask you everything because we want our listeners to go and get your book. So we'll leave some stuff open.
Sure.
But for me, a big question with a lot of people John and I talk to is, when you started out, did you have mentors, or did you have people who excited you about getting into being an engineer and producer?
My parents moved to Los Angeles from San Francisco when I was going into my senior year of high school. And I met some guys there that were starting a band. And so I joined in with them playing organ. And we started writing songs and playing around town. And the songs that we wrote, we thought were pretty good. So we went into a little local studio and put 3 of them down and sent them off to someone in the record business. One of the guys in the band, his mother knew someone who knew someone in the record business. And that someone was Gary Usher, who was friends with the Beach Boy Wilson family, and actually wanted to be a Beach Boy, but didn't make it. And for Al Jardine got the other post. But he did write 409 and In My Room with Brian. So it shows they were good friends. And he had just made a production deal with Decca Records, and he thought one of our songs was a smash. So he called us in for a meeting. We went to the Capitol Tower, where his office was at the time, met with him, and he signed us up. And we went into Capitol to record. And the second day, he brought in a really good guitarist to augment the band, a really creative guy named Richie Podler. And we'd never heard such a musician ever. Guy was just brilliant. And so anyway, that was that. We did 4 sides. That's what we were signed to do. In those days, you made a deal. The record deal was, do 4 sides. If you manage to get a hit, you run in and do 6 more and have an album. And let's face it, the LA Teens never made an album. And but we when we got dropped, I went to Richie, who had now built a studio, and actually his 3rd studio. I went to his studio and told him the sad story, and he said, "Oh, I can get you guys another record deal." Yeah, which was wonderful. He said, "Go see this guy, Mike Curb. He's going to go places," and he wasn't wrong about that for sure. Anyway, we got our 2nd record deal, and we went into Richie's studio to record. And on the first playback of the first track that we cut, when I walked into the control room, I looked up at those speakers as the sound was coming out of them, and it was a real defining moment for me. It just blew me away. There was so much more of a musical impact to his sound than what the engineer at Capitol had gotten. And I was just blown away. And when the song was over, the track was over, I pointed to all the equipment and said, "Can you teach me how to do this?" And he said, "No, I'm teaching Bill Cooper here. Go out and do another take." But that was the moment that would solidify my life. And so I went off and learned on my own. And I had started college actually in aerospace. And I guess where my left brain and right brain meet caused me to learn engineering very, very quickly. I did have a very, very good mentor, a guy named Toby Foster, who was an excellent engineer and maintenance man and good friend to this day. So after 2.5 years of chasing the LA Teens, I went back to college with my tail between my legs. And every day after college, I would go to the studio that Toby worked in and asked him, "Okay, now what's a dynamic mic again? A condenser mic? I don't remember that." On and on and on. And he would take as much as he could. And then he'd say, "All right, that's enough. See you tomorrow." The interesting thing is that in less than 3 years from the time I had that defining moment in Richie's control room, I had learned engineering enough and felt confident enough that I spent 2 months begging him to give me a job in the studio. He had another engineer that was leaving, and I begged him for 2 months until he finally gave me a shot. And he threw me in the deep end of the pool with Three Dog Night, who at that point, he was only engineering. Oh. His biggest client in the studio was a producer named Gabriel Meckler, who produced both Three Dog Night's first record and Steppenwolf. The real miracle of this story is, why would he throw me in the deep end of the pool with his biggest client, recording a band that had already had a hit and was on their way to being one of the biggest bands in the country? Why would he do that? If I'd fallen on my face, he could well have lost his client. Right. But for whatever reason, he did. And for whatever other reasons, I managed to swim. And that was it. That's great. So he would be my second mentor, I would say.
Were you like totally freaked out about, stepping in as the engineer at that point? Or were you just like, I've got to do it? And
well, what happened was he threw me in the first morning on a demo session, just a 3-hour demo session where you record 3 or 4 songs and put a vocal on it and do a rough mix for publishers. And they said I was fine. So then the next day he sent me in again on a different company's publishing demo, 9 a.m. in the morning. I called and said, "How did they say I did?" And they said you were fine also. I said, "Oh, great. What now?" "Well, come tomorrow night and do Three Dog Night." And at that point, I freaked because I knew who they were. And now wait a minute, they'd already made a record. They already had hits. And, that demo session was the biggest thing I'd ever done, really, those 2 demo sessions. Yeah. So, I was a bit freaked out, but I did the first night, I cut a track with him. I called the next morning to Richie. What did Gabriel say? Said, "You were great." "Oh, good. But now come in tonight, do it again."
Great.
Okay. Went in, did a second one, called him the next morning, same bit. All right. Third night, I'm in there and they asked for a guitar effect or something like that, some guitar sound that I couldn't do. Undoubtedly, Richie had done on their previous album because as I said, he's a phenomenal musician, guitar player. So I had to call Richie to come down and bail me out. And that ended my tracking with them. But he did have me do some more overdubs and whatnot as the album went on. And that was their second album.
So just stylistically, you were in LA, was it a surf band? Was it a rock band?
Well, I was a huge Beach Boys fan. In fact, in the beginning, even over the Beatles. That would definitely change. But I was a huge Beach Boys fan, primarily not just the songs, but I loved the harmonies. I've been a freak for, harmony vocals forever. And what Brian did, obviously, was brilliant. So the band was actually a combination of the English sound that had come in and the Beach Boys.
Your discography is so diverse but obviously it grew out of your love for, sort of American rock music, right? But you've done jazz. Over the years you've really, and is that just like you go with the flow? Someone calls, says we want Bill, and you go, sure, I'll do it, and next thing you know, you're making great jazz records.
Yeah, the thing is, I grew up in Phoenix, and I was an only child. And so the radio was my best friend. And in those days, the radio, they were not beholden to playlists. So the disc jockey could play whatever he wanted. And a 3-hour shift, he'd have a certain feel for what he liked. But you could, if he wanted to play a hillbilly record in the middle of his jazz set, he would do it if he felt like it. So I got to hear all kinds of music and fell in love with all kinds of music. If I have to pick a genre, it would be R&B. But I do love all genres of music. I mean, I almost hate to say that. And obviously been very fortunate to be able to do that, to be able to work in all genres, especially since the record business really wants to pigeonhole you. They want to put you in a box every chance they can.
Yep.
In fact, as an example of that box, so I came out of Ritchie's American Recording, which became, because of Steppenwolf, Three Dog Night, Black Oak, Arkansas, Byron Butterfly, a lot of rock stuff that he had done in there. That's what I came out of. And Richard Perry, the great producer, Richard Perry, I had met when I did a short stint at Columbia Records. And he went off to do Carly Simon's first album that he did, her third album, No Secrets, in England. And he called me from England to say, I'm doing it here with Robin Jeffrey Cable, one of Elton's engineers that was a great engineer. And he said, but there's 2 rock songs that I really want you to mix. So I'm saving those and I'll mix those with you when I get back to LA. And that was so funny to me. I mean, not at the time, I understood it completely. But what would be so funny is that, 10 years later, I couldn't get a rock act if I tried. I started having so much success in pop and whatnot that I guess I wasn't edgy enough for rock, even though there were a lot of rock acts I would have loved to have done.
Do you adjust your technique for the different genres? I mean, you have, you stylistically change it up because that works better?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great engineer, very, very good British engineer who will remain nameless. And he was one of these that had his own sound. And he did a jazz record. And his sound, which was very, very close, present, tight mic'd on all the drums and whatnot, it just didn't work for me at all. Jazz is more open and free flowing, and this right in your face with everything kind of sound I thought was silly. I believe that my job, whether I'm engineering or producing, is a servant's role. I'm there serving the artist and their music. And I think an artist's music is best served when everything works for it. And there just isn't one size that fits all for me.
Right. When you mentioned R&B, obviously Marvin Gaye is the sort of, for everyone, probably one of the top few R&B recording artists of all time. How did you come about getting into working with him?
I had mixed several records for Motown, but I never got credit. And one of the many wise things that Richie Podler taught me when I was working for him was the credits that you get on an album are more important than the money you'll make from the album. The money you're going to spend, but the credit will get you your next job. Clive Davis told me a similar thing a few years later when he said, this is a business of what have you done lately? So I was quite upset that I had done 3 Motown albums and I didn't get any credit. A special thanks is all that's on the record. And so
Wow.
I got called into the Motown offices by Suzanne DePass, who was Berry Gordy's right-hand girl. And she said, Marvin is going to do a live album on a tour that he's starting. He hasn't performed in 4 or 5 years. And he had been very upset when his singing partner died unexpectedly. And so he had not quit the business, but he had not worked live at all. So now he was going back, and they were very excited about it. And they knew the crowd would love him and everything, but they were nervous about how he would do. But they thought it was well worth it to try to capture it. So I sat in the office there with Suzanne, and I said, oh, great, I would love to. It was going to be another one shot. I had done a one shot deal a couple of years earlier with Barbra Streisand. One shot to me is where a live recording where you're only going to record one night, and the only rehearsal you have is the sound check in the afternoon.
Wow.
So the pressure is immense. And I assume that's why they called me for it, to be honest, from the Streisand album, because that's the only live album at that point I had ever done. So I said, I just have 2, I called them requests, but they really were demands, that I get credit on the album as the engineer. And she said, oh, absolutely. And that I get a shot at mixing it. If Marvin doesn't want to use my mix, that's his decision, but I really want a shot at mixing it. And she said, okay, no problem. Well, 1 out of 2 isn't bad. I got the credit, but I didn't get the shot to mix it. But I went to the Oakland Coliseum and set it up that afternoon during the sound check. And he had an absolutely astounding band, the best R&B band you could put together in the mid 70s, along with a nice brass section and even some strings. The coolest part of doing that record and the story with it for me is that I think it was almost 20 years later, Motown is sold, and they have a girl that runs a division called Special Products Division. She called me up and said, you did an album with Marvin Gaye in the 70s. I went, yeah, I did. She said, I would like you to remix it.
Oh, wow.
I went, what?
Wow.
And I didn't question why. I just said, I would love to. And I've never heard of an album that was a very successful album being remixed, 20 years later. But in came the tapes to my studio. And what's funny is that, your handwriting doesn't change over time. So I looked on the legend, on the track sheet where you see all the titles and what's on every track. And I recognized my handwriting all right. Well, your humor doesn't change either. And there were 2 tracks of strings on the 24 track. And there was an asterisk right by the word strings. And then at the bottom of the track sheet, the key to the asterisk was good luck with that. Because the idea of getting any kind of string sound when you've got a kicking R&B band and a horn section is good luck with that. So, but I did get a chance.
How did you do with that?
I loved it. If I can humbly say, I do think my mix was better. At least I liked it better. Right. Unfortunately, Marvin never got to hear it because he had, been tragically shot sometime earlier.
A live recording. That sounds like, I want to take antacid just thinking about that. I can't imagine. Especially if you're these major artists, and like you're saying, you get a sound check, and then it's time to roll, and there's about a million things that could possibly go wrong.
Oh, believe me.
Yeah.
And the worst one for me would have been the first one, which was Barbra Streisand. And it went down just fine. But when I say worst, I mean what you're talking about. Yeah. Where are the antacid tablets, please? Because I was scared. I didn't even want to do it. It was Richard Perry who convinced me that, that, no, you can do it. You can do it. And I went, if you say so. But, it's just you deal with what you deal with, like in any session. But it's just the lack of control, the unknowns and all that happen.
So Barbara and Marvin are using handheld microphones?
Yeah, in those years especially, we didn't have the kind of microphones for that kind of thing that we would even 10 years, 15 years later. But, you still make do. It's not terrible. And there was always, it was understood that a live recording isn't going to have quite the fidelity that the control of a recording studio will give you. Right.
But you're really reliant on their mic technique.
Yeah.
Because
they're
doing that, and they're probably walking around the stage so, boy.
Yeah, but I think when you're working with a Marvin Gaye or Barbra Streisand, they're professionals. I mean, I'm sure they have wonderful technique. It's like the old stories about John Lennon's mic technique. You know, I would assume that they would at least be helpful in the way they, you know, work the microphones. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. I did Natalie Cole, another one, you know, just they know what they're doing for sure in that realm. Yeah.
You mentioned Richard Perry. So you went on to do a string of years working with him. How did you choose your studios with him? Was it based on the artist or based on what you wanted?
For the most part, it was based on what I wanted. And, you know, producers, of course, if I'm producing, then it was obvious I could do it. But I think most producers want the engineer to be in a place that he feels he can do the best job. And so that's how it worked in that regard. Once in a while, you have to make a change. For instance, on the first Ringo album that I did with Richard, where we literally had 3 of the Beatles at one night, the only time after they broke up and the only time ever that 3 of the Beatles would play in the same room after the breakup. I wanted to do it in a little studio that I had become quite fond of called Producer's Workshop. It was a small, relatively small studio with a very small control room. And Richard thought that the control room was just too small. He was afraid that it was going to turn into a party atmosphere, which it more than did. The biggest party atmosphere I've ever been involved with in a control room. And so we went to Sunset Sound instead of that. But funny enough, when Gary Katz called me in 76, I guess it was, to do Steely Dan, the album that would become Asia, I asked him if we could work in my favorite studio. And he said, sure, whatever you want. And so we went to the Producer's Workshop. And I don't think that Donald, Walter, or Gary ever saw the place until the day we walked in for the first session.
Wow.
And that record sounds so like amazingly tight and just so clear. And I guess that's because you said it's a smaller room, or was that the case?
Yeah, I mean, several things. It was a relatively small room that still sounded good. And early in my career, I didn't understand everything about that. The environment that you put the instruments in makes a big difference on the final sound. But I had found that studio already early on and knew that it sounded good, even though it was kind of small. It was not a super dead room. I mean, it's by comparison, that's kind of relatively dead album, I suppose. But the main thing also for me was the console. The recording console in there was a custom-made console and was my favorite console until another one of my favorites was what Alan Sides put in the very first Ocean Way studio in Hollywood, which was another homemade console, until 1981 or 2 when I finished my console, custom made. We built the console for my studio. So I just had an early attraction to consoles that were made homemade. And the reason being is that in every case, they were incredibly simple. They didn't have a ton of bells and whistles. You might have to patch things that in a more modern console you wouldn't have to, but you didn't go through electronics 100% of the time for features that you might only use 10 or 20% of the time. That console made a big difference in that room also.
Right, but you're mentioning all these amazing studios and all this great gear. What led you to wanting your own room, to wanting to build your own studio?
You know, I suppose it's every engineer's dream to have their own toolbox, so to speak. It was certainly mine. I had worked in a lot of studios, obviously, in the 70s and saw different things that, were great in each one. That second mentor, Toby Foster, he and I had that dream. And by the time we started, I knew that we could build one of the best studios ever built. I didn't know how to do it all, but I knew the main 2 things that had to start were we had to have a room with a sound, and I wanted a big room, and the electronics had to be astoundingly great. So he and another gentleman and I put the electronics together, and that was a lot of work building a console, needless to say.
How big was the actual studio room?
It was about 1,600 square feet, 1,700, 22-foot ceiling.
Wow.
And the only thing I knew on the acoustics was to use Celotex. That's the 1-foot squares with holes in it. They used to be on every classroom in every school in the United States in the 50s and 60s. And they're in every radio studio. That's what all the radio studios used. And a lot of good recording studios used them in the 50s and 60s as well. And I was attracted to that because I knew that even when you're in a radio studio, which was all complete, tons of that stuff in there, it wasn't anechoic when you spoke. If you're in a room with all fiberglass, that's what they make anechoic chambers out of, is fiberglass, and it's very anechoic. So I like the fact that there was, even in a dead room, and I wouldn't use it in every wall, but even in a completely dead room, that it wasn't hurting your ears. And so that's what it was. That's what I used.
Right. That's kind of a lesson in building studios, is that, and I've kind of heard this before, where let it be live and keep bringing it down until you like it. If you go the other way, it's not going to work.
Exactly.
Right.
You can always make a live room deader. You can't make a dead room liver. There are plenty of boxes, hardware boxes, or today plugins on a computer that we use to affect the sound, that you can change the sound and make it, more something, more anything except more natural. There's nothing that will go the other way.
Right.
Nothing. So if you start with the most natural sound, you can definitely mess it up, use different boxes of coloration, distortions, whatever you want to go that direction. But if you start off with not a lot of resolution, you're never going to be able to go backwards.
I think we need to get Eventide to do a natural plugin.
There you go.
How long did you have your studio for?
A little over 30 years. It was a very sad thing because, for my money, it's the most high resolution studio I've ever been in. And everything went great until this thing called technology basically pulled the rug out from under the record business. When everybody had the ability to have professional recording in their house for, $1,500, which is what basically can do, everyone started recording in home studios, and studios couldn't stay alive. I knew it was over when Rod Stewart was doing an album in my studio. And Rod, basically has any budget he wants. There's no budget. And the bills went in, and the production coordinator from New York from the record company called and said, what's with this bill? And I said, I'm sorry, what do you mean? Well, why is it so much? I said, well, that's what we charge. And she said, really? $2,000 a day? Wow, we don't pay that anymore. We've been paying, $1,200 a day. And I said, well, I'm sorry, that's what I charge. And I knew right then, it's over. It's over. I could see that, it's going to continue to happen. So it wasn't too long after that there were 3 mix rooms next door. Larrabee had 3 mix rooms next door. And they had always said, if you ever want to sell the studio, we would love to take it. And so I did that. I didn't want to bastardize it and, start going down to those kind of rates. And so it was just too demoralizing to me. So.
But like, one of the things you mentioned, which I really wanted to ask you, was like, with technology, I mean, we all, John, myself, and you, have like, the gear that we have used has gone from being one distinct thing to exactly something that did not exist before.
Sure.
Other than, the things we like, microphones and preamps and compressors. But now we're in this digital world. And how was that for you as all the studios turned from analog to digital? Did you embrace it, or did you go kicking and screaming, or?
I went kicking and screaming.
Me too.
For one reason and one reason only. Early digital sounded like crap to me. Right. If I'd thought it sounded better, it would have been a different story. Yeah. But, needless to say, that you guys know, and that, between higher sampling rates, higher bit rates, better filtering, better converters both ways, a lot has changed. Yeah. But in the beginning, not so much. But more importantly, I think, to the point, though, and apart from that, obviously I kept my eye right on it because, again, the future's coming. Just like Pro Tools. The first Pro Tools was horrible to me. I couldn't imagine recording on it back then. But when I saw the production value of it, I knew right then, okay, you're going to learn this, and you're going to learn it well, because you're going to be living in it. It's just a matter of time. I thought early on, we didn't know what kind of technological change was going to happen, because, like you're pointing out, this was major change, not minor. But I knew that change happens and you have to stay, with it. My example that I thought of and gave to friends was I don't want to be the best buggy whip maker. You know, I think about going into the 20th century, you know, when the guy had learned from his father the art of buggy whip making, and his grandfather had established it, and they had 3 generations of the best buggy whip makers you could ever imagine. And then he's doing a great job, except everyone wants a car, not a buggy. And so I didn't want to be sitting back there, you know, standing my ground for something that no one cared about.
Right. There's certain studios in New York City. I fulfilled the role of coming in every 3 months to make sure their multi-track worked. And they really appreciated it. I was like the guy, oh, John's here. Let's fire up the 24 track and see if it still works. I was going to ask, let's go back to Asia, because it's such a great record. And that record is really so clear and just everything. It's almost like everything is just so in your face, but there's still depth. I mean, what was that experience like with them? I mean,
okay, well, the deal is I had friends that had played on their previous records, Jeff Porcaro, Michael Amarty, and good friends that had told me about what, you know, about how they would twist the cloth to get every drop out, kind of thing. Right. And so when I was asked to do the recording for the next record, I was a little afraid because I don't really like doing that. I really like to shoot from the hip. Experimentation and whatnot is great, but I mean, I really, creativity for me happens when things are moving and shaking. But I couldn't have been more wrong. I mean, they were very relaxed. They had all studio musicians now, just nothing but the best of the best. It had, as Gary Katz told me, it would have a revolving door of drummers, meaning that, you know, I would get a new drum sound every few days. And it was a no drug zone at the time. I mean, it was just as relaxed. We didn't do crazy hours. We started at 2 and ended, you know, early, nothing late, no late nights. It was just, it was just wonderful. And,
you know, John, also to your point about the sonics of that record, it's also, you know, and maybe Bill could speak to this a little bit. The arrangements help that. You know,
sure.
Right.
The clarity and the depth sort of comes, you know, it's the way it's recorded and the way it's mixed, but it also, the artfulness of the way it's arranged is
absolutely. And, you know, they obviously, the other thing is they had hit upon something in the songwriting that they hadn't done before. Touches of, but the songwriting was, you know, otherworldly in double entendre. I mean, for them and for all of us. I mean, literally every day when I got in the car, I would pop in a cassette of whatever we had done, and just marveled at what it was. It was like astounding every day. Right. And I remember thinking, what is this? It's kind of jazzy. It's bluesy once in a while. It sometimes has a little bit of a rock edge. You know, what is it? It's just incredibly different. But so it starts with the otherworldly songwriting. And then every song, they came in with a piano bass demo, just the two of them. Sometimes it might have a rough vocal on it if they'd gotten that far. Sometimes it didn't. And they would play it for the band, and they had given it to Larry Carlton, who had done takedowns on it. And I don't recall that he did that much in the quote arranging of it. It was pretty much what Donald and Walter had done in terms of where the pieces were going to go. They all felt incredible, just as they were. In fact, on more than one occasion, a musician would say to them, "Why don't you just overdub the drums on your demo? And, you know, we don't need to cut this.
Right.
They're perfect. It's perfect." And Donald would say every time, "No, we'll get it better." I don't know that we really did, to be honest. I do think that they could have done that on a couple of them, but I'm glad that they did it the way they did it. Let's put it that way anyway. Yeah. But yeah, your point's very well taken.
I talk to a lot of young artists. Sometimes I get are these new songs too different from our old songs? Or does it sound too different? And sometimes I do say, like, think about like how Steely Dan just grew as artists, you know, and think about Reeling in the Years and then Asia. And it's phenomenal. And it's a perfect example of what you do, what you love to do as an artist. Yeah. The other night, me and my wife went to see the Sparks Brothers documentary. Oh. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Sparks, but every one of their records was like 25 records. They're all different, and it's fantastic to be able to to progress or whatever. Anyway.
Yeah. And to your point, it points out something else too, that all artists, real ones, real good ones, especially, they progress. They don't, go into a rut and stay there forever and ever. They, most of them want to progress, and they're able to. And as you pointed out, look at what happened with Steely Dan. And what that goes to today is how sad it is that the record business is what it is, has become what it's become,
right.
That new artists don't get that opportunity. The very few that get signed, they're going to make it right away, or that's it, they're out. And
right.
How many examples of, I produced a band called Pablo Cruz back in the 70s.
Yeah.
And that was their third record. It was their third record that had a hit on it. They asked me to do the second, and I met with them, and I didn't think they had any songs. And so I passed on it. But then the next one, they sent me some demos, and one of them was a song called What You Gonna Do? And I went, I'll be right up. But that was their third record. And Steely Dan, that's their what? What record was that? Fourth?
Yeah, maybe fourth or even.
And look what happened. Those kinds of things, how many artists are we never going to know what they could have become because they won't get a chance to develop, learn from their mistakes and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you did the follow-up, right? You did Gaucho.
All I did on Gaucho, let me back up. So here they are, they blossom with Asia. I think the three of us can agree on that. And so how do you follow it up? Well, you change absolutely everything.
Right.
Everything.
Right.
You start by going to New York instead of staying in LA, with the same basic kind of musicians that you had. Then they got the microscope. On Asia, on the tracking, like I said, there were no microscopes involved until they went for overdubbing. And that's fine because they knew what to do in terms of keeping the feel of those tracks. And I know that they bounced around with a lot of ideas that they put down and then threw out just to keep the feel of those tracks. But then they go to New York for the next album, and so many things went wrong. Walter had his share of problems.
Yeah.
Hit by a taxi, his girlfriend overdosed. That famous bit with the song that second engineer erased, and they went back and tried to re-record it and never could do it. And they gave up. No, we had the take, it's gone forever. And at that point, they actually pulled out a song with Steve Gadd on drums that they didn't use on Asia. And that's on the album. And then that's the only reason that I'm accredited on that record. When we went up to get the Grammy for the best engineered album, I asked Elliot if I could speak first, Elliot Shiner, who mixed it, or most of it. And he said, sure. And I said, I reached into the microphone and looked at the other guys and said, I'm really just along for the ride on this one, guys. And Elliot puts his head in the mic and says, are you kidding, Bill? If it wasn't for that song, we'd still be making that record. And there was more than a note of truth in that, as you know,
right.
And it ended up with only 7 songs or something.
Yeah,
and one of them was from the previous album. So it was a nightmare kind of album for them. And the other thing, of course, they got into this, on Asia, they wanted to try different drummers, which is, with their different feels, which is, I think, wonderful, because all great drummers don't feel the same. They all play great, but they don't feel the same. And so what now? Now they were trying on Gaucho, they were trying to make the perfect drum take, whatever that means. And I remember Jeff Porcaro coming back after a week in New York telling me, oh my gosh, they drove me insane. They had me record the same song with 3 different rhythm sections, and all they wanted was the best feeling drum take out of me. When they thought they had it with rhythm section B, they would erase all of the rhythm section and redo it to my drums. They got a little bit nuts. And, who's to say, anybody's creativity where it leads them? I don't understand it. I think it's counterproductive, but whatever. Having said that, it did lead them to have their engineer, Roger, build, the first computer operated drum machine, Wendell, that he built during the making.
Oh, right.
During the making of that album. And so there, you want perfect drums. Now you got perfect drums.
Yeah.
And of course that started the whole revolution through the 80s of drum machines. And a lot of us going, the beat is absolutely perfect, but does it feel good? Yeah. And then it turned into that whole Megillah.
I remember on early, and I don't remember which record it was. It was either Countdown to Ecstasy or Katie Lied or one of them. I remember reading the liner notes on the back. It says something like, individual microphone equalization is frowned upon. This is their notes that they're writing on the back. The use of the mu major chord, which is the 1, 2, and 3 in the same chord, which is kind of blew my mind because that is the sound that they have created that makes them different than anything else. They're not afraid to put 3 notes together, which are right next to each other, which no one does. I don't even think any classical composer ever did that. And there was one other little specific thing that I went, these guys aren't just like sitting in a room jamming. They're actually scientifically,
they're thinking.
They're understanding how the molecules are moving. On top of it, they're obviously writing these incredibly fun, deep, personal songs.
Another fun little tidbit is that my earliest experience in 1970, probably at CBS, was on a Barbra Streisand record. And there is a song on that record that was written by Donald and Walter when they were just songwriters before Steely Dan was formed. That was their first cover, I believe, as songwriters. And I'm not even sure if they'd moved to LA yet. They might have still been in New York.
Wow.
And it's I would call it a normal song compared to what they wrote later on as a band, but it was quite a nice song.
It's amazing. Yeah, I always loved how smart but yet clever and funny they, you know what I mean? They just had it both.
Yeah.
It was really great how they did that.
Exactly.
But then you're also making Miles Davis records. It's fucking crazy.
I'm just glancing at the discography. Bill, I hope you have a lot of time. This could go on for 4 days. Because some of my favorite records and some of my favorite artists, but Asia is not unrelated to Pablo Cruz. I mean, if anyone could kind of take something and be in their bag, Pablo Cruz really copped their sexiness or their sense of feel. Were they an intact band? Were they like a full unit, or were they studio guys?
Oh, no, they were an intact band. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a second album to be done, and A&M Records called and asked if I wanted to produce them. They sent me the first album, and I liked the first album. So I met with them. Like I said, I didn't think that they had any songs ready to go, and they wanted to record right away. But what I heard that day and would go on to hear when I made the first record was the band had an incredible drummer, Steve Price. It's just an incredible feeling drummer. And I remember a couple of years later when Jeff Porcaro came by when I was doing some overdubs with him. I did some overdubs on one song, started on the second one, got up the rough mix, and Jeff came up behind me while I was putting the rough mix together and whispered in my ear, "I like that drummer." And I went, "Yeah, I do too." So Steve Price was just an incredible feeling drummer. And the bass player, Bud Cockrell, was a Southern boy, very soulful guy. Both his singing, had a great voice, a great singing voice, and his bass playing. And the groove that those two could strike up was sensational. Then on What You're Gonna Do, the guitar player has Dave Jenkins that was a duet between the two guys. And that's what everything I heard on that demo was essentially the hit. They already had it, really, because the groove was solid and the lyrics were good, and they traded off the two voices and everything, and it was just wonderful. The crazy thing was the record comes out and is flying up the charts, and Bud's wife makes him quit the band to start a band with her. She was a singer, and she wanted him to do a duet with her. And I was just like, are you kidding me? And so that's what they did. And Jerry Moss gave them a record deal because he knew how good Bud was. And of course, sadly, nothing ever happened with the duet. Then for the next record, they found a guy that Bruce Day that had played with Santana. And I went back to Sausalito, where we had done the first record at the record plant. And I started doing the second record. And after a week, I pulled the guys aside and said, I don't know how to tell you this, but we got to get another bass player. The groove is just not there. The magic is gone.
Wow.
I thought they would argue with me at first, because they'd invested in this guy and everything, but they didn't. And I brought in Mike Porcaro, Jeff's brother, great brother, that would go on later years to replace David Hungate in Toto, because I knew he was laid back and I knew he was a great bass player, and I knew he was laid back, just the right kind of, and about the same age, just perfect to fit in with them. And indeed he was and did. And we did the next record, with him. And as I wrote in the book, we'll never know what might have happened with Pablo Cruz if Bud had stayed in the band, because between his singing, his playing, and additional songwriting, he was a big piece of that foursome to lose.
Speaking about the Porcaros, what a musical family.
Yeah.
It's like, how many are there? And they're all like great musicians. Right?
There's 3 brothers. They're all great musicians. And the sister is a great flautist. She never did it professionally. And of course, that all stems from their father, Joe, who was a sensational drummer and percussionist himself, and an extremely professional guy, old school professional guy, showed up, you show up early for sessions and all that. And all of the kids were trained by Joe. So they're just all very sweet and just wonderful people to work with.
Producing, engineering, mixing, right? 3 very different gigs if you do them independently. When you produce records, do you engineer when you produce?
Yes. I've tried it. I've trained a few people, and I tried it in the past, and it just didn't work for me. The console became my instrument when I gave up playing. I mean, I think music the whole time I'm recording or mixing, obviously. And so to produce, to be thinking music, I can't do it when I'm just sitting in a chair. I got to be able to touch a fader or something, just the way it works for me.
To me, that's so important, because when I'm producing something, the fact that I can go up and change a balance very quickly will often tell me where I am. And if I can't get my hands on it quick enough to actually do that, because, balance is critical, right? It's hard for me to tell it if anything is a good take if it's not in balance, and I can't hear it in perspective of what it's going to live, right? So at times when I haven't engineered and I'm sitting in the back of the room and I can't make that quick move to just see if I can nestle it into a balance that I really like, that becomes very frustrating.
Sure.
And so I appreciate you knowing that that's a critical thing.
I thought you were going in a different direction with that question.
What was that?
I thought you were going like producing, engineering, mixing. How come you don't master it?
I did a teeny bit of that in the beginning, but as to balance, yes. Richie Podler, again, when the LA Teens recorded with him, it was 4-track. So, you were cutting the track, usually back then on 1 track. What he did, it was on 1 track was the track. And then you started overdubbing, and you might ping pong a couple of times if you had to, if you were running out. But by 3 Dog Night, by the time I went to work for him, it was 8-track. And I remember, and it's so cute when you think about 8-track with what he said compared to today. But he said that, I start thinking about the mix from the first note. Don't wait for the mix to do the mix. You're mixing from, put the record together. And all of us, I think, older school people that way had to think that way. You sort of had to. And then, like someone asked me recently, so what was it like when they said, you're going to have 16 tracks? Were you scared or happy or what? And, maybe it was a combination of both. I don't know. But obviously, you certainly felt the limitations of 8-track. And we thought that was the engineers, like I said, that's really when I got into it. 8 tracks. Wow, how great. But now 16, so,
right.
And of course, now today it's whatever. Let's not talk about it.
Yeah, now it's great today. Now you can have your singer do 80 tracks of vocals and then comp from it.
Right.
But I love that.
But
one of the hardest things for me is, mixing. I love mixing. That's still one of my favorite things to do. If I'm not producing is number 1, but mixing is number 2. But what's happened today is so many things that we can't control, like file management. In analog, file management was easy. Why? Because it was a track sheet and it had 16 or 24 or 48 tracks of audio, and it said what was on each one, and that's it. And today, just the way different people organize all of that stuff is absolutely nuts. And that's just before you open the Pro Tools session, just trying to figure out what they're talking about. And some people keep every single Pro Tools session they've ever done without putting them in a previous session folder or whatever, just to make the mixer's job hell. But when they're making the record now, Some of them are very well organized, and others, it's all over the place. I don't even understand how they can keep track while they're doing overdubs,
Right.
let alone thinking about turning it over to somebody to mix what they would like to hear or see.
It's the age of non-commitment. People they're not forced to do it. I understand that, but I think committing to something early on really helps the foundation be more solid than saying, oh, it could all be changed at any point. That sort of drives me crazy. But John, as well, John, much more than me, works as a mixer, as do you, where you get tracks from anywhere, right? People send them to you. Do you look at the tracks? And this is a question for John as well. Do you ask for a session before you accept the gig? Or do you just say, okay, I'll do it, and then all of a sudden something shows up and it is what it is?
It is what it is, yeah. I've never asked on that. I've asked to hear something before I agreed to mix it, just to make the record for one reason or another. But no, I've never asked for that first and been very unpleasantly surprised sometimes.
Do you ever ask for a session to?
No, I never do. But one of my favorite moments in life is hitting open on that session and then watching it come up and be like, oh, fuck.
Either
Or this is great.
Right.
Yeah. I just finished yesterday morning some songs from a guy in Singapore. And he's a medical doctor that produces records. He loves music and he's produced records for 40 years. And darn if he isn't really good at everything. I mean, it's just amazing to me. Everything was well laid out. And musically, he's very astute. He's obviously a good musician and whatnot. And it was a thrill.
Were the tracks labeled in English?
They were in English, but you couldn't read it. You had to open it up to see it. You couldn't see it on the console. You had to open it up and then you could, because it had other kinds of letters before it that meant something to them, but not me.
That is the wonderful thing about this era, is like you're mixing stuff from, you said Singapore? Yeah. I just mixed a band from Sweden and I FaceTime with them every couple of days, but they just sent me the files. It's fantastic. I love that. Whereas those doors wouldn't really be open in 1980.
No, not even close. When I had the studio and people started being able to record at home, I'm, complaining like crazy, this home studio thing. So here we are now, quite a few years later, where I have a mix room in my house and, they're doggone, it's really nice. I'm an early riser. Yeah. My wife isn't. And so, I'm up at 6 a.m. and I'm in there mixing and it's wonderful. So, here you are complaining one year and then maybe a couple of decades later, I are one.
Hey, and then, so you're in Nashville, how many years?
3, coming up on 3.
So were you ever aware of that law that just got overturned where you couldn't have a commercial facility in the house? Do you know about this?
Oh yeah. That's in Nashville proper, Davidson County.
Oh, right. You're in Franklin.
I'm in Franklin.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. I finally did a record in Nashville last summer and man, what a great town. And I got to see Steve Mark Antonio a couple of times and I got to hang with Vance Powell.
Sputnik.
And well, yeah. And I love that. I mean, and I brought my daughter there, who was 15 or 14 at the time. And he gave us the tour. He gave us T-shirts. She was, so into him because he works with Chris Stapleton. So he's got a little 15-year-old fan club, which is great. But I love the town. I can't wait to come back. I really can't.
You'll have to hit me up when you come back.
Of course. Definitely.
Hey.
What, Stewie?
Huey Lewis. Got one word for you. Huey Lewis.
Stewart, breaking it back down to reality here. Sorry.
I want the dirt. I want the real dirt. So you worked with Huey Lewis. You produced Huey Lewis.
So Bob Brown was the manager of Pablo Cruz. He was a stock trader when I did their third album, the first one I did. He was still trading stocks. He was about to quit because the first album took off, and they were making money and touring and whatnot. But he called me in 1979 and said, "Will you fly up here? I want you to tell me I'm crazy." I said, "I can do that over the phone, Bob."
You're crazy.
Yeah. So, okay, sure. What is it? He said, I found another band. I said, okay. So I went up, little town, Corte Madera, north of the city, and went to Uncle Charlie's and I saw Huey Lewis and American Express, and in this bar, and they played. I went upstairs to the little after room. I hung out with the guys for half an hour or so, and then went back to the hotel. And Bob called me the next day and said, well, what'd you think? And I said, well, the band's pretty good. The songs need work, but that kid is a star. There was no doubt in my mind that what he could do to an audience, he was a star. There was just no other word for it. So he said, great, do you want to work with him? I said, sure. So I went up and got to know the band better in their rehearsal studio and whatnot. And we worked on some of the material. And I hate saying it, but Huey's heard it now. He didn't hear it for many, many, many years, but I didn't like any of the material. But we went in to a little studio in San Francisco and did some demos. And Bob came down to LA and took them around and got turned down by absolutely everyone. And it wasn't until Chris Ellis of Chrysalis heard what I heard that the band got signed. So Huey came down to LA and we were talking about how to proceed with the record. And I took him to American, to Richie Podler's studio, where I had gotten my big break. And he fell madly in love with it. It was this very old school studio with rotary pots on this little homemade console. And it was an old school vibe, to be sure, having been built in the early 60s. So he really wanted to record there. And I was kind of scared, to be honest, because a lot had changed since I left American in terms of technology and whatnot. And what worked for me, in 1969, I didn't know if in 79 was going to work. But when he fell in love with that studio, we were going to do it in that studio. So, okay. But he also had this idea. He said, look, this was in the new wave movement, which I wasn't particularly a fan of. A lot of the songs were written around eighth notes on the bass. And it was this, new wave attitude. So it was like, he said, we want to go in and do it and get out. We're not going to overanalyze. We're just going to jump in and jump out. Okay, fine, whatever. So that's what we did in that studio, which was not fun for me. But when I got down to doing overdubs, I called Bob and I said, Bob, I don't think there's any hits on this record. He said, look, do a rough mix on the 3 best songs. I'll take him to Chrysalis. That's what I did. That's what he did. Called me up. They think we're in great shape. This is a hit. That's going to be number 2, and we might get lucky with this ballad. Okay, whatever. So that's what we did. We finished the record, and we had a playback party. We had decided to record in LA as a kick in the pants for the band, thought it might be good for them. And we rented a house in Laurel Canyon, the great Laurel Canyon, which was the music mecca of the 60s, figuring that would be helpful for them, inspiring and whatnot, which I think it was. And we had a playback party in the house that they had been living in when the album was done. And the head of A&R at the time, Roger Watson, was at said party. And they invited some of their friends, the Doobie Brothers. And it was like a typical playback party with a lot of backslapping going on. And, oh, you guys are great. Oh, that's a great song. Oh, listen how great that sounds, on and on and on. And Roger Watson comes up to me and he says, well, Bill, what do you think? And I said, seriously, Roger, I'll tell you what I think. I think we don't have a hit on this record. And he looked at me like my Diet Coke was full of rum or something and said, no, I think we're fine. And that was that. Record came out with a good amount of promotion. Single flew up the charts 1 week and flew right back down the next. Nothing on the record happened, nothing. And I'm building my studio at this point. I'm in the construction zone and the phone rings and it's Huey and he's really depressed. I said, what's wrong? He said, Roger Watson just called and said, we got to get a new producer because there were no hits on the record.
Oh, man.
What? And I had to hold my cool as best I could because I had never told him. In fact, I never told him this story until I finished the book and sent it to him. And all I said to him was, Huey, this is a crazy business, but I'll tell you what, you're going to make it, whether I'm there or I'm not there. And I'll be right there when it happens, egging you on. And I got off the phone with him and said Roger Watson, and gave him a small piece of my mind. And then got his boss and he for a dinner where I gave him the rest of my mind. How in the world is this possibly fair? Roger, I looked you in the eye at the playback party and told you that I didn't think there was a hit on this record. Why am I being punished? And love him dearly, I have to hold Bob Brown a little bit responsible in this too, the manager, because soon thereafter, Huey called me up 3 weeks later and said, I've interviewed 3 producers. I don't like any of them. He still wanted me to do the records. And I thought we were going to grow old and gray together making records. And a little more time went by, and he stopped by the studio construction site, and he said, I'm not going to play this for you. I couldn't anyway. I didn't have any. It was a construction site. He said, I'm not going to play you what we just did. We went into a studio with what one of the producers they think would be good for us. If they think this is what Huey Lewis should sound like, I'm not going to make records. That's it. And from there, somehow, Bob Brown got them to let Huey and the band produce themselves. So why wouldn't I hold it against Bob? I had told Bob I didn't think there were any hits on the record either. And now I'm being punished.
Right.
So that's what happened.
Right.
They went in, they made the next record. They got it close to being finished. Guess what? Somebody thought there wasn't a hit on the record. And he called his old buddy Mutt Lang and said, Mutt, I need a hit song. And Mutt gave him, I can't remember the original title now, but he changed the title to Do You Believe in Love? Mm-hmm. And that was their first hit. Mm-hmm. And then, as we talked about earlier, artists developing on the next record, Sports, the new wave thing was leaving, and they were starting, and they were aimed towards what they ended up being, which on Sports. So the songwriting definitely was evolving and changing, and everything was great. And of course, I couldn't have been happier for them. Well, maybe I could have been a little happier for me, but I was thrilled. And so this went on, and I told this story, you guys, I told this story just like this for 10 years. And at the end of it, I always said, but I wouldn't be surprised if we don't get back together someday. And sure enough, that day came when, after the record they did that was a little on the jazzy side, where they changed up a little too much and the fans went, wait a minute. Bob called me and said, they're starting to make another record and we're having some problems. You want to come up here and talk? And I said, sure. I went up and went to Bob's house where I would usually stay. And he played me a song called A Couple Days Off. And I said, yes, I would love to. So we went in and made that last record that we did together. And it was such an interesting thing to have gone from the first record to 4 records, 5 records later, because, they were very unstudio savvy on the first record, very green, all of them, except for Huey. And now they all knew everything about what it took to do what they wanted to do. And of course, so it thrilled me almost to a fault, to the degree that he would go, was that the old Get In and Get Out was certainly not being used anymore. Right. And I'm not saying we did anything with a microscope, except maybe his vocals. But he was great. He would take him home, and he would come back, and he said exactly the lines he wanted to redo.
How long did it take you to write the book?
If I condensed it, because it was in between working and so on and so on, it's not like I sat down and did it. If I condensed it, I would say it probably took a year and a half. It wasn't short. It was a great time, though. I loved doing it. It was so much fun. And in fact, I know as I've gone on that I've done tons and tons of incredible albums, but it wasn't until I was about a third to halfway through the book, and I'd taken a break for a couple of weeks for some sessions or something. And I got back to it, and I sort of skimmed the working titles that I had, and I went, wow.
Yeah.
I've heard people say stuff like, I just started, whenever I just wrote a paragraph at a time, and then I put it all together. Is that the process you did, or did you just do stretches of this was the 70s and 80s and stuff like that? Yeah.
Basically, I just I started at the beginning, so to speak, and then just started with earliest records and whatever came to me, And sometimes what I would do is I would Google an artist or a record to jog my memory, which worked very well. I always loved telling stories. There was a point in my career when I felt I had done all I was going to do, that I was going through my divorce, and I did a song called Up Where We Belong that Taylor Hackford had done the movie for. Taylor Hackford, the great director. And I was going through my divorce and, feeling glum and whatnot. And I thought, I love telling stories. Maybe I should go in the movie business, and I actually asked, a cheeky kid that I am, I actually asked Taylor if it would be possible to shadow him on his next movie to see how all the pieces fit together. He didn't say no, but he certainly didn't say yes. So I stayed in music.
That's so funny.
Good for us.
But
yeah.
As my story goes, people were always saying when I would tell the stories, why don't you write a book? Why don't you write a book?
Right.
And I felt it was too self-serving. It was just going to be, I did this, then I did that, then I did this, then I did that.
Right.
I didn't like that feel of that. And it wasn't until a producer that took me to dinner after a session and I started telling stories, said, you should write a book. And I went, yeah, I've heard it before. And he said, no, seriously, he said, look, the record business as we know it, or let's have a moment of silence for as we knew it. The record business as we know it was born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s, and peaked in the 70s going into the 80s. It was a very short time, a very iconic time, never to be repeated again. And you were there.
Right.
And when he said you were there, it dawned on me. I could say all kinds of stories that I had nothing to do with to break up I did this, then I did that. As it turns out, in the editing process, the editor took out a lot of that stuff. So in a sense, it still is, I did this and then I did that. But, I got some of the stories in there. Like you mentioned Miles Davis earlier. Yeah. One of my fun Miles Davis stories that did make it into the book was Toto did a jazz song that they had written, and they wanted Miles to blow over it. So they called him and sent him the tune and said what it was. And they said, come by David's house, so-and-so time. Oh, perfect. So they told me he walks up in total red leather, top to bottom, with Elvis glasses on, and rings the doorbell. They let him in the door, and David had his German Shepherd stuffed in the doorway, in the entryway. And Miles walks in with his shades, takes his shades off, looks down and freaks at the dog. And they said, don't worry, he's dead. And Miles looks at him and says, I got some shit. Bring that cat back to life.
Oh, God.
That was one of the stories I had nothing to do with that I just thought was funny enough that I'd put it in the book. The first time I worked for Miles was not with Miles, which was mixing the Tutu album. And Marcus Miller, the phenomenal New York bass player, I had worked with him on some of the jazz records I did there, and he worked with Miles and had me mix the stuff, and that was great. And then the next album, Amandala, same thing. So it was only mixing, and I never met him. However,
gotcha.
The year after that, Tommy LaPuma asked me to come to Europe to do a live recording of Miles on the European jazz festivals, chase him around with another recording truck. And so that was the first time I actually worked with Miles. But our opening meeting was quite something, because it was the first gig was an outdoor festival, and Miles walks up with Tommy, and Tommy introduces me as who I am, the engineer that's going to record your album and whatnot. And just then the tour manager walks up, and he says, Miles, the equipment didn't arrive from the States, but don't worry, I've been all day working on it, and I've got all the instrumentation. We're ready to go tonight. And Miles just looks at him and goes, I ain't playing no effing rented equipment. Cancel the show. And we got in the car together and went back to the hotel, and he was just bitching like crazy that, they had all the time to get this thing together. What the hell is going on? Who's working for me? What the hell is this? I don't know. Would the rented of equipment been that bad? It wasn't a rented horn, Miles. You got your own horn. But whatever.
He did some recording with Tio Macero at the record plant when I was a tape librarian.
Oh, wow.
And that was a trip. I mean, it must have been 1980. And Jay Messina was the engineer. But I got to just like peek in just for a second, and it was pretty intense. And I was not really hip to him at that point. I was a 21-year-old like prog rock or whatever, Pink Floyd fan or something. But no, I find him fascinating. And I did go back to listen to the records later, and it's just wonderful.
Yeah.
It's like, what a
brilliant
legend.
Musician. And it's funny that, that Tutu album, which, was a huge left turn. It was so interesting to me how, and it was to be expected that a portion of the jazz community would go, oh my God, he's sold out. He's this, he's that. But I was almost more amazed at how many positives out of the jazz community, even, there were some that went, my God, he's done it again. He's changed the tide. Not that a whole lot of people followed that necessarily, but that's obviously many have, but it's quite interesting.
Bill, we can't thank you enough. It's amazing sitting with you, and I'm so glad you guys reached out. I'm going to bug you if I come down to Nashville.
Yeah,
so,
please.
Great. That'd be really good.
All right.
Bill, I advise you to be very busy that day. If he
It depends if he's buying lunch or not.
Well, that I was going to say, my trick is I always forget my credit card. That's my thing. Stewart knows that.
All right, guys.
Thank you, Bill. It's been really a pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
All right, have a good one.
Right. Bye-bye.
Me and Stewie want to thank all you Gear Clubbers for listening to this crazy podcast we do. If you can, leave a review on iTunes. It really makes a difference. And don't be shy. We love hearing from you guys on the social media at Gear Club Podcast. Don't forget to go to gearclubpodcast.com for Spotify playlists, links and photos for the episodes, and my favorite hot sauce of the month.